I want everybody to, I'm going to tell you about a funny story that happened to me in Albany, Georgia a few months ago. I kept talking about a tree and this and a tree and that. And this farmer stood up at the Rotary Club after the speech at the Doublegate Country Club, and he says, Senator Isakson, I only went to Doherty County High School. I can't understand, how much is a tree, and can you explain that? Well, I started trying to explain it. You know, it was very difficult. In fact, I made an absolute fool out of myself. When I got home that night to my wife, and I said, sweetheart, I got stumped today. She said, what was the question? I said, I couldn't adequately explain how much a trade was. I just couldn't think of a good example. She said, well, why don't you just figure out how many years have to go by for a trillion seconds to pass out? Give it to people. I said, that's a great idea. So I pulled out the calculator and I multiplied 60 seconds times 60 minutes to get the number of seconds in an hour, and multiplied that times 24 for the number of seconds in a day, multiplied that times 365 for the number of seconds in a year. And then I divided that into a trillion, and you know what the answer is? 31,709 years. It takes 31,709 years for a trillion seconds to go. The United States owes 12 trillion now. We're going to 19 trillion before the end of the decade, and it's unsustainable. So as I begin my remarks, I want to talk about that. This is the Chamber of Commerce, and I want to talk about economics, and I want to talk about what I think we are not doing that is correct and what we need to do that would help our economy, because everybody is struggling. And we're struggling in large measure because of two things. Well, because of three things. One is debt, one is unpredictable regulation, and the other is unpredictable taxation. And that's a very difficult trilogy for any business and enterprise to operate in and make long-term plans. One good example is last week in the Senate we passed a financial modernization bill, a bill that was a reaction to the crash in 2008 and 2009 on Wall Street. Now, just to give you a preface of this piece of legislation, without taking too much credit myself, Kent Conrad of North Dakota and I passed the Financial Markets Crisis Commission in 2009. It was a bipartisan investigatory body with subpoena rights, an $8 million budget, and some of the smartest minds in the country to investigate the collapse of the financial markets in 08 and 09 and recommend to Congress, including the ability to subpoena and refer to the Justice Department what we need to do to fix it. They're supposed to report back to us on December 31st of this year. So for some unknown reason, we started doing financial modernization in reaction to Wall Street in the middle of this year, in the absence of any of the information from those bodies. So number one, this is a rush to judgment prior to the election. Number two, it reminds me so much of Sarbanes-Oxley. I'll never forget when Sarbanes-Oxley came forward. I was a member of the House, and I voted for Sarbanes-Oxley. So did 403 of the 408 people that were in Congress that day. It was almost a unanimous vote. And as all of us know, it was an overreach. It was the correct thing to do because of what had happened at WorldCom and Enron, Ken Lay, Bernie Evers, and what they'd done to destroy 401ks. But as government always does, and the pendulum always does, it swung way too far the other direction. And it came in and scooped up a lot of small businesses and turned them from profitable enterprises just into negative enterprises simply because of accounting rules and nothing else. So it was a rush to judgment, but it was a reaction to a terrible crisis. Well, we had a terrible crisis in 08 and 09. But I'm afraid the financial modernization bill, as it is now called, and is now in a conference committee between the House and the Senate, is precisely the same thing. It's a political document, it's not a practical document. And it's a political document that's going to cost most American businesses more to stay in business. It is more regulation without repealing any regulation, unless you work for Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae, who are exempt from the scrutiny of the financial modernization bill, if you can imagine that. It is a pervasive, far-reaching piece of legislation, which adds to our banking system, already regulated by the FDA. Here we are, we've got a banking system where we've had a very tragic situation in banking. We've had banks that we have lost. But you know, there's not a single depositor in Georgia that's lost a dime. And the banks that were lost, their assets have been either taken in by FDIC or sold or transferred to other banks, and they're doing workouts. We've got a regulatory system that works, painful as it has been, it works. Well, now on top of that, we're putting a consumer finance agency. It's going to be on top of Main Street banks as well as everyone else. In fact, if you own a business and you ever extend a payment plan beyond 120 days to a customer, like if you ran a funeral home and had a $10,000 funeral and the family came in and said, we can only pay you $500 a month for the next 15 months, and you say, I'll take it. You become a regulated financial entity under the new law, just because it's longer than 120 days. If you're an orthodontist that puts in braces that cost a lot, I never had to buy those, but I had a lot of my friends' kids who had to buy them. They had to work out payment plans longer than 120 days. It becomes regulated. It was, once again, an overly pervasive reach of government to reach into Main Street, and it avoided going to Wall Street. And I think when the Financial Markets Crisis Commission reports back this December, they'll uncover where the bodies are buried. They'll give us the facts and information, just like the 9/11 Commission did, as to what we need to do to react to a terrible tragedy. But for us to rush to judgment, I think, was a terrible mistake, and unfortunately it's going to mean a lot more regulation for a lot more businesses in the not too distant future. As far as the economy is concerned, there are some green shoots, but we're in a protracted recovery. A protracted recovery over a long period of time, 5 to 7 years, at the end of which is going to be a new normal. I don't know what it's going to be. There's only one thing that will accelerate that recovery, and it's not going to be putting stimulus money out by the government, because that ends up being borrowed debt, which just makes the problem worse. But it is going to be bringing about some resolve to the regulatory regimen and the tax regimen that the American business community has to operate on. Tomorrow or tonight, we start in Washington on a tax extenders bill. A tax extenders bill that for 1 year will extend some R&D tax credits, but it's also going to bring in a whole new number of new taxes to pay for extended benefits, which just delay the recovery that we have, increase the debt that we have, and make it more difficult for this economy to recover. So I'm going to stand firm, and I know Tom does a great job in the House of standing firm on the economic issues and the expansive issues in terms of government. It is time that we got back to the basics of ensuring the playing field that you compete on is level but not weighted. That's number one. Number two, the tax system that you work under is predictable and fair. And number three, the government understands we prosper most when the private sector prospers. And private sector prospers least when government thrives. There is only one city in America that has expanded its employment in the last year and a half. And that's Washington. It has 142,000 more employees. Everybody else in the country is dealing with unemployment of 8 to 13%. And we've got to turn that paradigm around, and we've got to get it back the other way. And just for a second, in terms of nationally, we have a lot of things going on internationally, and sometimes when economic times get difficult, you kind of forget about little things like the war in Afghanistan. The war in Afghanistan is improving from our standpoint. I commend the President on committing the troops necessary. If you ever met a general, David Petraeus was good, but McChrystal is equally as good. We have a lot of brave young men and women who are fighting, and unfortunately some of them are dying, but we're beginning to change the paradigm in Afghanistan. I made a speech in 2001 at the Field of Flags that the Marietta Rotary Club put up. Some of you probably saw that. The 2,998 flags paying tribute to those that died in the World Trade Center. And I made a speech that day in which I said something that became profound, and it comes from me. That's pretty unusual. In fact, it's rare. In fact, it only happened this one time. But in trying to describe to a reporter what we were about to face, I said, we're about to face the ultimate war between good and evil. And we've been fighting it for 9 years, and although President Bush got a little credit for it, and a lot of people that had a lot of roles had a little credit for it, in Iraq today you have a fledgling democracy in a place that's a very dangerous part of the world. And in Afghanistan there is hope that we can eradicate the Taliban, let the Afghani people self-determine their future, and again, in a very dangerous part of the world, have peace and security. Radical terrorism will destroy everything that is good and noble in the world. The fight that we're fighting is right, and it is worthwhile, and it is essential to see to it that the world survives in a time and peace, and hopefully ultimately prosperity. So everywhere I go, I know in this room today, there are parents of, or brothers and sisters of, or friends of men and women that are deployed deployed in Afghanistan and Iraq. And I just want to tell you, a night doesn't go by that I don't say my prayers and think about the sacrifice they're making so myself and my wife and my 3 children and my 9 grandchildren can live in the greatest country on the face of this earth. So when you say yours tonight, remember those folks. They're doing a tremendous job for us. Now, I think as an elected official in the United States Senate or in the Congress of the United States, to stand up before a distinguished group of folks and not talk about what's going on in the Gulf for a second is really probably unacceptable. I am one who has been an advocate of extracting our own resources for energy. I think it's very important that we be energy independent, but the tragedy in the Gulf is terrible and it's inexcusable. It's become pretty obvious to me that British Petroleum didn't have a contingency plan in the event of something bad happening when it happened. This is a warning system for all of us to make sure that in the future we have a redundancy of systems in terms of offshore drilling that can protect the environment from the type of destruction that's now going on in the Gulf. It's absolutely essential we do that for 2 reasons. One, it's the right thing to do for the environment. But second of all, if we do it right, we've got the resources to keep us from being prisoners to Brazil and Chavez, to Venezuela and Chavez, and to Ahmadinejad and Iran, and to the other dangerous parts of the world that we're funding today with our purchases of their oil. But as bad as that is, what has happened in the Gulf is terrible. And I am committed to see to it. We have a hearing on June the 10th. I'm on the subcommittee that oversees occupational safety and hazards to workers, which gives us jurisdiction over precisely what happened on that oil rig. Patty Murray from Washington and I, she's the chairman, I'm the ranking member of the committee, have called for an all-day hearing. We're bringing in the workers that were on that rig that night when it blew, and the engineers, and we're going to do everything we can to get the government to get to the bottom of the situation, and as quick as we can, find a solution for the current problem and prevention for future problems. Because we cannot afford to destroy our environment for any cost. But most importantly, we cannot afford not to correct a problem which causes us a loss of some of our own domestic resources in the United States of America.